Amaka was so happy to see Cheta in her home. He had come to see her mother to declare his intentions to marry her, and her mother seemed so receptive of him. They discussed for a few minutes, and her mother told Cheta to come with her. Amaka was so confused as she wondered where they were going. To her utmost surprise, her mother took Cheta to her dirty room, which had not been cleaned in months. Remnants of food items and dirty clothes could be seen littered all over the place as Cheta walked into the room, looking so disgusted and appalled. "My daughter is such a lazy and dirty girl," her mother said to Cheta, whose gaze panned through the room repeatedly, shocked to see how dirty everywhere looked. Amaka was so bewildered as she could not believe that her own mother had decided to air her dirty linen in front of the man who had come to ask for her hand in marriage. Cheta's face reeked of disgust as he turned to her and asked how a beautiful girl like her could live comfortably in such a dirty place. Amaka could see how disgusted he looked as he shook his head and informed her mother that he was no longer interested in marrying her daughter. Amaka could feel her heart drop as she watched Cheta walk out of their home with his brothers. She ran as fast as she could to plead with him to change his mind, but Cheta informed her that he was not willing to marry a pig for a wife. Amaka, heartbroken and in tears, returned to confront her mother, who seemed not to be bothered by all that had happened. "How could you, Mama?" she asked her mother, who blatantly ignored her and walked into her room. Amaka could not understand what she had ever done wrong to her mother to deserve such level of wickedness from her. A day that was supposed to be a happy day for her suddenly turned to her worst as Amaka stood in the corner, grieving the rejection she had just received. Unable to withstand the pain, Amaka decided to go visit her friend Chinelo, who lived a short distance from where she lived.
"Is everything okay?"
Chinelo asked Amaka, who narrated how her mother ruined her chances of marrying Cheta. Chinelo could not believe her ears.
"Why would your mother do such a thing to you?"
She asked Amaka, who stared at her confused, unable to answer her question.
"Are you sure you didn't wrong your mother in any way?"
Chinelo asked Amaka, who could not remember doing anything wrong to her mother.
"So, what are you going to do now?"
Chinelo asked, as Amaka revealed to her that she had no other option but to move on with her life, as Cheta was no longer interested in marrying her. Night came, and Amaka returned home sad to meet her mother, who was busy eating her dinner. She found it shocking to see that her own dinner too had been set after all that had happened on that fateful day. Amaka in that moment could not bring herself to eat the food as her heart was so heavy towards her mother. She stared at her mother for a few minutes, unsure of what to do or say to her, expecting her mother to explain her reason for doing what she did, but all she saw was her mother, who looked so unbothered about her actions. Amaka in that moment could feel her anger rising. She decided to ignore her mother as she walked into her dirty room, not caring about the food that her mother had prepared for her to eat. All she could think about was how wicked her mother was for ruining her chances of marrying Cheta, who she believed was a kind and loving man. If only my mother respected herself, Cheta would have proceeded with the marital rites, Amaka thought to herself as tears poured down her eyes. The next morning, Amaka sat in her room as she thought of what to do. "I should clean up my room," she thought to herself, but the zeal to do so was completely lost. So, she continued to live her life in the pile of dirt that was her abode, and this went on for a while until one fateful morning when she came across a handsome young man who seemed unable to take his eyes off her. His name was Odili, and he was Chinelo's brother's friend who just returned from the city to visit his family. Odili was immediately struck by her beauty and decided to get to know her. They spent time together, and Odili could not get enough of her. The way she laughed and her overall beauty and charm endeared her to him as he asked her to be his wife. Wamaka, without wasting any time, agreed to marry him, despite being afraid of what her mother could do. She spoke to her friend Chinelu, who advised her to tidy up her room to ensure that her mother had nothing to say to ruin her chances with Odili. That's a good idea. Wamaka concurred as she returned home and began to tidy up her room. She spent hours cleaning up the room and could not believe the amount of mess that came out of her small room. Once she was done cleaning the room, she approached her mother to reveal that a young man was coming to visit her soon to ask for her hand in marriage. Wamaka pleaded with her mother not to ruin her second chance at love. She showed her mother her tidy room, saying that she went through the stress of cleaning up her room so as to ensure that her dirtiness did not come in the way of her happiness. Her mother looked at her and smiled and asked when the young man would be visiting. Wamaka's heart was so full of joy as she watched her mother smile happily at the clean room. "He will be visiting in 2 days," she replied her mother, who quickly rushed off to the market to buy the food items that they would need to entertain their visitors. Wamaka could not help but dance in joy. She approached her friend Chinelo with the good news, and Chinelo was so happy to see the joy in her friend's eyes. "It seems you love him so much," she asked Wamaka, who could not help but smile as she gushed over Odili in excitement. The day finally arrived, and Wamaka could not contain her joy. She insisted on cooking the pepper soup that the visitors were going to eat. Her mother was so happy to see how excited she looked as she asked her a few questions about Odili, and Wamaka found herself spilling all the interesting details about him to her mother, who stood there and listened to her. After a few hours, Wamaka finished cooking the pepper soup and called on her mother to come have a taste. She looked so excited to see what her mother thought about her cooking and was so shocked to hear that the soup tasted so horrible. "What?" Wamaka dished some soup in a plate to taste and spat it out immediately. It was only a few minutes before their visitors arrived, and her mother, seeing how worried she looked, decided to quickly prepare another batch of pepper soup for them. Wamaka was so grateful to her mother as she thanked her and rushed off to prepare for their arrival. Her mother remained in the kitchen as she quickly prepared another pot of soup. Just as she finished from the kitchen, she heard a knock on their door and called on Wamaka to go welcome their visitors as she quickly rushed to her room to go change into a befitting dress. Wamaka was so excited to see Odili and his family in her home. She ushered them in and ensured that they were comfortable as her mother quickly rushed into the kitchen to dish some food for their visitors. She called on Wamaka to serve them the food, and Wamaka did as her mother had instructed. With a smile on her face, Wamaka served the pepper soup to Odili and his family. They all took a sip, and immediately the expressions on their faces changed. Odili coughed slightly, trying to hide his discomfort, but it was evident that the soup was horrible. Odili's mother, trying to remain polite, asked who prepared the soup, and before Wamaka could respond to her question, her mother interrupted and said that Wamaka made the soup herself as she wanted to impress them all with her cooking skills. Wamaka stood there frozen, her heart sinking as she realized what her mother had just done. She had served the horrible batch of soup Wamaka initially prepared, not the second batch that her mother made to fix the situation. Odili, looking so embarrassed and disappointed, set his spoon down as he voiced out his displeasure at the fact that Wamaka did not know how to cook. "How did you plan on getting married without knowing how to cook?" he asked Wamaka, who stood there embarrassed as she watched his father and mother walk out of their house disappointed. Without mincing any words, Odile informed Wamaka that their marriage plans cannot proceed. You should learn how to cook first before accepting to be a wife, he said to her as he walked out of her home to go join his parents. Wamaka was so mortified. She looked at her mother and could not believe what she had done. Her heart ached as tears streamed down her face. Why, Mama? Why would you sabotage me again? I cleaned. I tried. I did everything right this time. Her mother ignored her and walked into her room, leaving her there in distress. Wamaka screamed out in pain. She could not understand why her mother seemed to be so mean to her all of a sudden. Are you really my mother? She screamed out loud as she locked herself up in her room, questioning how a mother would be so cruel as to cause her own daughter this much pain. A pain that seemed so unnecessary, as though there was a lingering beef between them. I can't take this anymore, Wamaka said to herself as she left their home angrily and went to see her friend Chinelo, who could not understand why all these were happening.
Have you tried to speak to your mother to know why she's against you getting married?
Chinelo asked Wamaka, who screamed out in anger that she hated her mother and wished that she would die. Everywhere fell silent as her words sank in and she burst out in tears. Wamaka in that moment decided not to fall in love again to avoid going through the torture of heartbreak, knowing that her mother might never allow her to get married. I think it is best I remain single and stop falling in love. This way, I will save myself from potential heartbreaks, she said to Chinelo, who advised her to speak to her mother instead to know why she was chasing her suitors away. Never. My mother means nothing to me from this moment forward, and I'll make sure that I stay out of her way and never involve her in any of my businesses, Wamaka said as she stood up and headed back home. She arrived home a few moments later and walked straight to her room, not caring if her mother was home or not, as she made up her mind never to speak or care for her mother again. They lived under the same roof, but as strangers who barely acknowledged each other's presence. This silent treatment continued for months, ruining the once peaceful relationship between the mother and daughter. During this time, Wamaka met a young man named Afam, who declared an interest in her. Afam was such a handsome and charming man. He saw Wamaka one evening, helping a little girl that fell and bruised her knees. Afam stood from a distance and watched as Wamaka carefully nursed the bruised knee and assisted the little girl home. On her way back, he approached her and tried to get to know her better, but Wamaka did not seem interested in him. However, Afam did not give up. Every evening, he ensured that he stood on the path that led to Wamaka's house, hoping to have a word with her, but Wamaka ignored him and acted as though he was invisible. One evening, Wamaka was taking a stroll with her friend Chinelo when Afam approached her and tried to speak to her. But as usual, she ignored him and all efforts by him to talk to her proved futile. Chinelo, witnessing all that had happened, asked Wamaka what all that was about, and Wamaka revealed to her that the young man had tormented her life for weeks and that she was tired of his constant disturbance. Chinelo, however, saw things differently.
Why don't you chase him away once and for all by showing him all your terrible sides? Trust me, he will run away at the first inconvenience.
Wow, that's a great idea. Wamaka agreed with her friend as she decided to go ahead with the plan. The next day, as she returned home, Afam approached her again to talk to her, but this time, Wamaka replied him with a smile on her face. They spoke for a few minutes, and Afam was so delighted to finally speak with her. As the days went by, Afam and Wamaka spent time getting to know each other. She realized that Afam was a medical doctor who recently moved to their village to work in one of the big hospitals. He spoke about himself and the fact that he grew up with his poor mother, who owned a very big restaurant in their village. Afam grew up working for his mother in her restaurant and perfected his cooking skills in the process. "I am also a very good cook," Wamaka boasted to him as she invited him to her house the next day to have a taste of her meal. Afam was so delighted as he accepted her invitation in a whim. Wamaka laughed inside her heart because she knew that her cooking would definitely chase him away, owing to the fact that he was a fantastic cook. The next day came, and Wamaka prepared a pot of pepper soup, the same type she prepared for Odile and his family on their first visit. Afam arrived her home and met her mother, who seemed shocked to see a young man in their home. She ushered him in and retired to her room, leaving him with Wamaka, who served him a plate of her terrible pepper soup. Afam, delighted to taste the soup, took his first spoon and paused for some seconds. Wamaka laughed in her heart as she tried so hard not to burst out in laughter. He took a second spoon and paused for another 5 seconds before finishing the soup. Wamaka looked at him shocked as she wondered how he was able to drink such a horrible soup. "How did it taste?" Wamaka asked him purposely to hear what he had to say about the soup. "I have never actually had this type of soup before," he replied Wamaka as he explained the uniqueness of its taste. Wamaka excused herself as she rushed off to her room to laugh. "This is just the beginning. I am sure after today you will leave me alone in peace," she said as she laughed to her heart's content. A few minutes later, she returned to the living room and met the room empty. Afam was nowhere to be found, and Wamaka could not believe how fast he gave up on her. She felt a mix of relief and regret, as a part of her hoped that he would stay. But Wamaka immediately shook off the feeling as she convinced herself that it was for the best. Her mother walked up to her, but Wamaka ignored her completely as she retired to her room, banging the door behind her. The anger in her heart for her mother had not seemed to die down, as Wamaka decided within herself never to forgive her mother for all the terrible things that she did to her. The next morning, Wamaka paid a visit to her friend Chinelo, narrating all that happened with Afam. Chinelo was so shocked to hear that Afam bailed on her, considering how persistent he seemed at first. A few days passed, and Wamaka saw no sign of Afam. She accepted her sad fate and moved on, trying not to allow another rejection to face her. Her mother tried on so many occasions to talk to her, but Wamaka was so unwilling to listen to what her mother had to say. She left the house and met with her friend Chinelo, who advised her to give her mother a listening ear. But Wamaka found herself fuming in anger as she remembered all the pain that her mother caused her for no just cause. "She must suffer the way she made me suffer," Wamaka said as she hardened her heart, refusing to listen to the counsel of her friend. Later that evening, Wamaka returned home and met Afam, standing in front of her house. "What are you doing here?" she asked Afam, who looked shocked to hear her question. "Is anything the problem?" he asked Wamaka, who yelled at him angrily and called him all sorts of condescending names. "How dare you show your face here?" After bailing out on me the other day, she said to Afam, who asked if her mother never delivered his message to her. Wamaka froze in shock as she never knew that Afam left a message for her with his mother. "That must be the reason why my mother has been trying to speak with me," she thought to herself as she asked him the reason why he decided to bail out on her the other day. "I had an emergency at the hospital," Afam said to Wamaka, who began to apologize to him for all the horrible things that she said to him. Immediately, they heard a loud sound inside the house and wondered what it could be. "What is that?" Afam asked Wamaka as they quickly rushed in to confirm the origin of the sound. To their surprise, they saw Wamaka's mother laying on the floor in Wamaka's untidy room. Her mother slumped on the floor in her room, and Afam had to rush into her dirty room to attend to her mother, who was laying there unconscious. "We need to rush her to the hospital immediately," Afam said as they quickly rushed her mother to the hospital. Wamaka stood there frozen as she watched her mother struggle for her life. All the anger and resentment she bore in her heart fizzled away and were replaced with regret. What was I thinking to ignore my own mother for this long? Wamaka asked herself as tears dropped from her eyes. Afam approached her to reveal that her mother was in a critical condition. "Will she be alright?" Wamaka asked as Afam looked her in the eyes, unable to give a definite answer. "Your mother has a 50-50 chance of survival," he said to Wamaka, whose heart began to race in fear. At that point, nothing else mattered, as Wamaka felt her heart sink with each passing second. A few minutes later, she was escorted into the emergency room, where her mother lay pale and weak, barely conscious. Taking her mother's hand, Wamaka began to apologize for all the terrible things that she did to her, not knowing that she was sick. Her mother, with a faint voice, spoke out to her, apologizing for being too harsh to her. "It was never about you, Wamaka. I was just trying to protect you the best way I could, as I couldn't stand and watch you make the same mistakes that I made in the past." What had happened was that so many years ago, Wamaka's mother got married to a man who made her life a living hell. He treated her so badly because she hid all her flaws from him, presenting herself as a completely different person. However, when he began to see her flaws, he transformed into a monster and made her life a living hell. Their marriage, however, ended shortly before Wamaka was born, and seeing the pain that she went through in her own life, she decided never to allow her own daughter pass through such pain. This was the reason why she was so harsh, ensuring that Wamaka's potential suitors knew all of her flaws beforehand. She believed that if a man could accept Wamaka with all her imperfections, then he would truly love and cherish her for who she was. Her approach, although misguided and harsh, was rooted in a desire to protect her daughter from the same kind of pain and disappointment she had endured. Wamaka listened to her mother as tears poured down her eyes. She realized the depth of her mother's love, which was expressed in such a painful and confusing way. Her heart filled with sorrow for the misunderstandings that led to resentment and neglect on her part. "I am so sorry, Mama. I never understood your reasons," Wamaka said as she squeezed her mother's hand, apologizing for all the terrible things that she did. Her mother smiled weakly as tears poured down her eyes. "I am sorry, my daughter. I should have explained everything to you, but I could not stand to see you broken by the constant heartbreak. My heart could not take it. That was why I ignored you. I am sorry," she said to Wamaka as she told her to promise her that she would marry a man who truly loved her regardless of her flaws. And Wamaka made the promise to her mother when everywhere went silent. "Mama, Mama," Wamaka called out as she noticed her mother's body stiffen.
Doctor!
She screamed out loud as the doctors and nurses flooded the room. Wamaka noticed her world stop in that instant. Her mother was dead. Afam quickly rushed to her to comfort her.
No!
She screamed as she immediately remembered the day she wished for her mother to die.
No! I killed my mother.
Wamaka cried out loud as Afam held her tightly and reassured her that she had no hand in her mother's death. His words, though kind, barely penetrated her veil of sorrow. In the days that followed, Wamaka laid her beloved mother to rest, mourning her loss deeply. She clung to the hope that the love her mother had always wished for her would one day find its way into her life. Though Afam stayed by her side throughout her grieving period, Wamaka couldn't shake off the feeling that his presence was driven by pity. She recalled the harsh words she had spoken to him and all her flaws that had been exposed to him as well. Wamaka wondered if a man like him could truly see a future with a woman like her. Just as she sat there thinking, she heard a knock on her door. Chinelo burst into the house, urging Nwamaka to follow her quickly. They both dashed out, with Nwamaka's heart racing in fear. "What's wrong?" she asked, her anxiety growing with each step that she took. "It's Afam," Chinelo replied, hurrying ahead. Nwamaka's panic deepened as she feared what might have happened to him. "Is he okay?" she asked Chinelo, who told her that something had happened to him and only Nwamaka had the power to save him. Nwamaka's heart raced as they both ran to Afam's home and met him down on one knee with a ring stretched out in his hand. "Will you marry me?" he asked Nwamaka, who could not believe her eyes. "Is this a joke?" she asked Afam, who assured her of his love for her. "I want to be with you, Nwamaka, to heal and build a future with you," he said as tears poured down her eyes. The heartbreak she had experienced, the misunderstandings with her mother, and the moments of intense loneliness all led up to this moment of unexpected joy. "Yes, Afam. Yes, I will marry you," Nwamaka finally said as Afam slipped the ring into her finger and stood up to embrace her as they both cried for joy and held each other in their arms. That was how Nwamaka found the perfect love with a man who loved her despite all of her flaws. They got married, and Nwamaka learned how to cook under the guidance of her lovely husband, who held her hands all through the way. They supported each other, and as the years went by, Nwamaka became a better version of herself. The lesson to be learned from this story is that true love goes beyond physical attraction and appearances. It also embraces a person's flaws and imperfections. Nwamaka's journey teaches us that genuine love is built on honesty, understanding, and mutual growth. It is important to confront and work through personal weaknesses rather than hide them, as this fosters stronger relationship and personal development. Additionally, the story reveals the importance of clear communication and understanding between people, as misunderstandings can lead to unnecessary pain and suffering. Also, the story highlights the value of resilience and self-improvement, showing that it is never too late to change, learn, and become a better version of oneself. Finally, be watchful of the utterances you make when angry, so as not to live a life of regret. I hope you enjoyed the story.